Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Combinate Podcast. I'm your host, Subi Sadeh. On this episode, we are graced and honored once again by my good friend, Chuck Ventura. You may remember Chuck and I share the same alma mater, and we've had a back and forth in the same companies for the first part of Chuck's career before he branched off on his own. Now he has his own consulting firm called Ventura Solutions, where he focuses on combination product development. And so what I wanted to bring you on to talk about, Chuck, is you tore it all down and went back to basics and put together this design input course. And whether it's the FDA guidance that has a page or whatever it is on design inputs, or the fact that there's a whole clause in the regulation and in the standards around design inputs, it's not really something that is focused on a whole lot in terms of the how. Now, I've seen design inputs in the context of a design control training. There's plenty of design controls trainings that speak to design inputs, but it's like, all right, we got to talk about design inputs before we talk about design outputs. So why the focus on design inputs?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me on your podcast again, and it's good to see you. And so thanks for that. And yeah, so relative to why design inputs, just first and foremost, I rarely hear anybody talking about design inputs. I see a lot of, especially when you look at LinkedIn, right? There's a lot of talk about like the new guidances. There's a lot of talk about risk management. I personally love risk management. I think there's a lot of education that's still needed on that topic. We're working on some courses on that topic too. And we do a lot of training and consulting in that area. But one area that I really don't hear people talk a lot about is design inputs, right? It's almost as if everybody just
knows.
assumes, oh, yeah, everybody knows how to do design inputs. And the one thing about design inputs is it's first off, especially on the when we go talk with some of our clients and look at files, I'm pretty shocked with the state that I see design inputs in. They're not always like in the best state or well written. And from experience, I have learned that poor design inputs tend to be one of the biggest contributors to de-accelerating product development, actually slowing down the product development process. And also, it tends to be a big reason why there's issues with products on the market. And we could talk more about why I feel that way on both ends, but those are some of the reasons why I created this course. And ultimately, it's about helping companies accelerate product development to get products into the market quicker and helping companies ensure market compliance to make sure their products are compliant. So at a high level, that's why I created the course.
In terms of the decelerating effect that quote unquote poor design inputs have on product development, is that because in many cases, design outputs are often written by product designers, whether it's the print spec sheet. A lot of times you have very technical people writing those things because they're going to be reviewed by a supplier. They're going to be reviewed by a CMO. The technical details need to matter because they're going to be used in process validation as an example, and so on. Design inputs are going to be, their next stop. Obviously, they're going to have an impact in terms of design, but where they're checked next is during design verification or some engineering study, right? And so is it that people are inexperienced and they're just throwing the kitchen sink at design inputs where they, rather than have 10 really good design inputs that are actually your requirements, they're doing 30 and 20 of them are unnecessary and the 10 that are necessary are poorly written?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think at a high level, I think one of the biggest problems is like human nature is just wanting to rush through and get done as quick as possible, right? The product development project. So design inputs is one of the only phase that you don't really need to have a physical product developed, right? And there's a lot of lead times and challenges. Like essentially, you could just write something on a piece of paper, right? And you can move quickly, essentially, right? I'm not saying that's what you should do. So design inputs.
That's what people think. What do you mean we need 6 months to do design inputs? All you need is a laptop in like a day.
Exactly. So that's where I think claiming we hit design input phase, like it's a milestone. It's even tied to in big companies, and it's tied to
Reviews.
in bonuses too, right? Like executive bonuses. Maybe you have to finish design input review by second quarter. So there's this human nature of saying, hey, we were done with design input phase, right? We made this big accomplishment. The second thing is there tends to be this, I call it like almost like a mind virus in our industry where it's just paperwork. And engineers are like, it's just paperwork. And then the third problem is just, and I use the saying from Field of Dreams, with the baseball field and Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come, right? So engineers just want to jump in and start building product, right? Before they truly even understand the requirements. So when you start thinking about these rushing through, trying to get the project done as quick as possible, this mindset of it's just paperwork, it's not that important. And then on top of that, let's just start building our product. That doesn't mean we shouldn't start building prototypes and evaluating the concept. But for those reasons, we tend to rush through that stage. And then where you start to de-accelerate product development, slow product development, is first off in the design output phase. If you miss some critical design inputs, right, you may have some product failure modes that you never thought of. I know this once happened it was a plastic disposable we were developing, and there was a living hinge. And it turned out that if you just torqued it a little bit, it would break. But no one created a design input on that. It was more just a linear force. So I don't want to go into too many more details, but if you don't have a full set of requirements, you can have issues with your design. Where I really see the biggest problems is design verification, right? And if you have a separate group that is doing design verification, like a separate team, I feel my heart goes out to those people the most. Because if you have systems engineering or design input team creating the design inputs, I've seen so many times where if the design inputs are not fully flushed out and everybody thinks the project's going great, oh, we're on track, we're hitting our milestones, then all of a sudden everything comes to a screeching halt in design verification. Because a lot of times it's not even clear what to test, right? And how are we going to test it? Or, hey, this requirement is written in a way I can't test it, or the parameters not correctly defined.
One of the things
So
that I used to see that I see a little bit less of now is that design inputs would be written in a way where it's the product must whatever. If it's written like product, some people write it like the product, like a PRD, the product must whatever. Some people write it like
yeah,
it's the design shall whatever. It depends on whatever the style they use. But it doesn't have very clear acceptance criteria in the design input requirement, where it doesn't talk about what level you may need to sample, to so on and so forth. And what ends up happening, like you were talking about having separate teams, particularly in big companies, is if you have a design input that has what the expectation is, but doesn't have very clear yes, no, pass, fail criteria, you end up putting a lot of weight on your verification protocol, but your design inputs are usually approved by the whole project team. And the design input or the verification protocol is typically just approved by, let's say, quality and the study lead. And so what
yeah,
ends up happening is you're writing the design input and and everybody's approving it, but in terms of its interpretation prior to testing, that's only happening by a small subset of the team, the study lead, and you're only talking about what it means in terms of test method development very late in the game. And what I started to see some companies as they mature is they put the acceptance criteria as well next to the design input and have it approved as part of the design input. How have you seen companies deal with that?
yeah. I think that's a great question. And there's always what level of granularity are you going to go to? If it's something like expulsion force, like with a pre-filled syringe, right? Like I think at a minimum, you want to have that parameter defined. For example, like if it's 4 pounds of force or 5 pounds of force or 22 newtons, for example. And you may also want to add like the rate at which you're pushing, right? The rate,
Mhm.
because and relate that to human factors. And that's probably enough for that type of requirement. Now, any further criteria like the sample size, in particular, that I like to leave for the verification plan, but we have a risk-based approach, right? Where it's defined in either the quality plan or the design verification plan, how the design input is related to risk controls in certain severity levels. They'll drive the sample size. So that, I would say, that level, I like to go there. But relative to all of this, especially with the acceptance criteria, know you're going to pass, just to step back in the development process, what we like to recommend is something also that in COSI, the Systems Engineering Society, recommends is how much time to spend, right? And what we recommend is about 30% of the project time is spent on creating design inputs, right? So if that's a 2-year project, that's quite a lot of time. But the key is it's not like you're just sitting in a desk writing design inputs and doing nothing else,
Yeah.
right? We recommend concurrent engineering. So while you're writing your design inputs, you're also prototyping your concept and then doing, which, as I'm sure, like engineering study loops,
Yeah.
right? So you're writing the design inputs, you're looking at certain parameters. And as you're writing the design inputs, especially if you're not the one testing them, you should be in the lab talking to the verification engineers and even talking with the technicians, right? And here's a system helping them understand, here's a user need, here's a system function we're looking at, here's how we're thinking about writing the design input. What are your thoughts? How are we going to test this? And you can get their input into that process, right? And then from there, some of the parameters and fine acceptance criteria may not be fully understood yet. So that's where, with the concurrent engineering, as you're going through these engineering study loops, also could be called as pre-V&V, right? Work with the verification engineers, work with the test method engineers to make sure that as they're developing the test method, it's meeting the intent all the way up to the user need. And in that process is where you're really refining your final specifications and acceptance criteria. So then when you do go into full verification, all of the test methods are already developed, they're validated. The verification engineer knows exactly what they're testing. And even the most important, the technician, the person doing the testing, is like, oh, I fully understand this requirement. I know everything that could potentially go wrong in the testing, and I'm 100% confident it's going to pass.
One of my foundational experiences in industry was I had to do this. I'm assuming you've seen sharp edge test requirements, right? Or I should say sharp edge requirements. Many companies will just say the how you define that is there is no user contacting area with a certain radius. They'll just like design verification by analysis it. I was working for a company that actually wanted to test it. And we found this UL test method for sharp edges that was used on toys. And so this is like one of the first protocols that I've ever written. I think prior to that, I had some like label legibility protocols, which are pretty straightforward, like label rub test and stuff like that. But this was my first like real test. And I'm like, what the hell? This is not like a functional test that's normal. And so anyways, I like look at the tester and I look at the UL method and all that stuff. And I write my protocol, I get it approved. And I go to train the technician on how to do it. And it's just, I should have probably tried to do this before I got this protocol approved and before I scheduled this training, because it was impossible. And I had to update the protocol before moving forward. But that was one of the first things that I learned is get if it's like a break loose extrusion force test that you've already validated for a different product and you just have a new syringe presentation, okay, you may not need to do that. But if it's a new test method, you should definitely make sure that and they'll give you really good feedback. But you talked about risk controls. And one of the kind of philosophical discussions that's always around design inputs is what is the difference between a design input and a risk control? If you look at 14971, it talks about there's like this double reference where risk management will reference design inputs and then design inputs will reference outputs of risk management. But they typically have, I've seen companies do DI dash and a separate RC dash for risk controls. And some companies are like very much against the idea of risk controls are not design inputs. And other companies are like, no, for a risk control that comes out. For example, what you talked about with the live hinge, it's okay, we have this failure mode. The design inputs that are based on the user needs are already captured. We have this failure mode around the hinge. So now we need a design input that says the hinge shall not break when it sees a whatever force applied at a certain moment or whatever. What is your opinion on the link between design inputs and risk controls? Are they the same thing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and we get asked that question all the time. So I like to think about the system level risk assessment, right? System level risk assessment as you identify hazards and hazardous situations, and then once you start defining certain sequence of events and that could bring the hazard to the hazardous situation with the user or patient, at that point, we recommend putting in place risk controls, right? Now, obviously, if it's a design related risk control, right? From there, I like to think about that as a parent. From a systems engineering perspective, there's this concept of parent and child requirements, right? So I like to look at risk controls as a parent requirement to design inputs. And I break up the parents into three categories. There's your user needs, which address the intended use, and then stakeholder needs, which are all the internal requirements from your company, like marketing, regulatory, quality, R&D, et cetera. And then the third category of parent requirements to our design inputs, I like to think of that as risk controls. So in this case, I would write them at a system level. For example, the hinge shall not break when rotated, right? And then that is now a parent to a design input. I would trace it to the design input, which would get into the more engineering specification level, like shall not break when torqued at 3 inch-pounds. And then that obviously will trace to the design output. And this is,
if I can jump
No,
in,
go ahead.
apologies. So then this is where I think the breakdown happens, because the trace matrices that I've seen, and I've seen this at multiple companies actually, is you'll have user need, design input,
Mhm.
risk control,
Mhm.
design output.
Yeah, personally, I don't like that.
And so what you're saying is you would say user need or risk control, because those are parents,
Yeah,
and then design input, then design output.
that's my preference.
See, that makes a lot,
Yep.
that actually makes a lot of sense.
And it makes sense. And then the other thing I was going to say about it is, in my mind, because in the physical world, in reality, the design output is the risk control, right? The design, the product, or if you're doing an inspection in the manufacturing plant, right? Those are the risk controls. So in my mind, from a process standpoint, the risk control is the risk control, and it traces to the design input is the design input. And then it traces to the design output, that's a design output. But when you step out and you step back a little bit, what is the true risk control? In my
It's a
mind,
spec.
this doesn't necessarily get documented, but in my mind, it's all of those.
Yeah.
It's the written risk control, it's the design input, it's the design output. That's the risk control.
Yeah. And I think that's where the implementation and effectiveness comes in. And there's probably some nuanced discussion there about the risk control as the parent. And so maybe implementation is either a design input or the spec. And then effectiveness is, does it actually work, whether it's a verification or validation. Where can people find you, Chuck, and tell folks about your course?
Yeah, like I said, the course, we do consulting, staffing, and training, right? And on the training, we do custom training courses for clients. But if you want something that's already created and like off the shelf, we now created this design input essentials course I'm the instructor on it. I have about 20 years of experience with design inputs, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And a lot of my own learnings are from my own mistakes that I made early on. And I just found myself having to repeat this to a lot of our clients and our own employees. And a lot of our clients were asking for a training like this. So what I did is I took 20 years of experience writing design inputs, reviewing design inputs, and jammed it into a course that has about 3 hours, a little over 3 hours of content. There's 8 modules and about 70 individual lessons that are like 2 to 5 minutes each. So you could go back to it and reference it. And we cover everything from why you need requirements to the about 15 or 16 ways to determine each requirement is adequate, all the different types of requirements. We talk about the economics of requirements and also how to get design inputs approved. There's some team building and some soft skills in there. And yeah, so created that course, and I think it adds a lot of value to clients and anybody that's, whether you're a new engineer or an engineering management. I think it's a helpful course. And yeah, you could find me on LinkedIn under Chuck Ventura. You could reach out to connect with me and reach out to me there, direct message, or you could find our company online at ventura-solutions.com.
Amazing. Thanks, Chuck. Great having you on again.